Walking along a trail at the base of Pikes Peak, you feel a growing unease. A creeping discomfort is crawling up your back and raising the hairs on your neck. Unable to shake it off, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and why we've never seen Lisa Ryther and Elizabeth Childs in the same room together. 3 people sit at a corner table by the fire. One of them keeps insisting that evangelical Anglo-Catholicism is actually a thing. And that's me, your co-host, Matthew Mellema. And welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches all across the Front Range dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. To bring about this goal, assuming we're not in a global pandemic, we have all sorts of programs, slates of concerts, talks, all sorts of get-togethers that sound horrifying to all of us in our COVID state. We also have an annual conference each April, not this one, but you know what I mean, called Imagination Redeemed, that attracts folks from all across the country. And we also have our own Arts Guild. And some of us in the Arts Guild, when we're not creating art, we like to podcast. Ergo, Believe to See. To find out more about Believe to See or our other podcasts, such as Redeemed Imagination and Speaking with Joy, check us out at anselmsociety.org. And why don't you go ahead and rate and review the show? I think it would be a great idea. It's not that hard. This is a true story. I listen to a ton of podcasts, and I have never, ever rated a show before until a couple nights ago. And I finally was like, hey, I tell people to rate and review this show. I should review other shows. I actually had the idea to review this show, but my wife told me that was tacky. So I'm still mulling that over. But anyway, the point of that is there's probably a lot of folks listening who just, they don't review, but it's actually really easy to do. So go ahead and do it. And I'm done telling you to do things. COVID stuff, we're all really sensitive to that sort of thing right now. But I want to turn this over to our co-host for the day, Mandy. Mandy, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing well. Have you ever reviewed a podcast?
I actually have. I've reviewed this one, but it was before I ever co-hosted, so I feel okay about that.
Okay. Well, there's something in my Google search history now saying that's the question, are you allowed to review your own podcast? I haven't yet. I'm still considering it. But it sounds like you had no conflict of interest at the time.
No, I did not. I'm actually kind of offended right now that you didn't memorize my glowing review. So, I don't know.
Maybe that'll be a thing. So there's lots of podcasts read all the nice reviews, which, I don't know, could be a thing. I don't know. Then we'd have to read the surly ones too. We only have a couple surly ones so far, but
now I want to go back and read the surly ones.
I don't know.
I suspect Marcus. I think Marcus did that.
It's just bitter.
Yeah.
It's your choice, Marcus. Went up to Portland. It's probably raining right now. Trailblazers aren't even in the playoffs right now. But anyway, this podcast that we are doing is actually a while in the making. Those of you who've been listening for a while may be familiar with, I thought it was the Notre Dame curse. It may actually be the Lisa Ryther curse. We're not sure. There's conflicting evidence on both sides. But we tried to record a podcast reflecting on Cathedral Notre Dame burning down with Lisa on 2 separate occasions. Both failed to record. This is highly unusual, by the way. So then we tried to record another episode, this current one with Lisa. This one at least had the common decency to fail to record at the very beginning. And now we come to this one. I have all my equipment set up. This is the first in-person show we have recorded since COVID. I'd say we're respectfully distanced from each other. But I bring all my fancy equipment. Doesn't work, even though it worked at home. Maybe, Lisa? I don't know.
You can blame it on me. It's okay.
Thank you. So let's bring you officially to the table. Lisa Ryther, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah.
Okay, so Lisa, you have been on before. Me and you argued about whether it's a good idea to outline your books or just dive right into it. Seems like you've had a fair amount of success since then diving into it. So we wanted to talk about your current writing. Before we do that, tell us a little bit about you and the general writerliness you do.
Well, yeah, my name is Lisa Ryther, but my pen name is Elizabeth Childs, and that's what I write under. Obviously, that's my pen name. But I started writing seriously a few years ago after my kids were old enough that they could sleep through the night. And I have 5 short stories currently published in various literary magazines and journals. Got a novel about ready to start querying to agents, so that's exciting. And I'm starting to get back into the writing again now that my youngest is about 8 months old.
Okay, so let's talk first of all about pen names. I've talked about pen names in the past. I've recently made the major transition on my own website to go from Matt to Matthew.
Wow.
I know, it was major. I go by Matthew at work now because I've noticed whenever I say Matt, people think I'm saying Max.
Oh.
How many Maxes have you met in your life? And how many Matts? Every other dude my age is named Matt.
That is true.
But everyone assumes I'm Max. So then I try to emphasize Matt. And that just makes it worse. So I'm Matthew now. I'm Matthew at work, so I may as well be Matthew when I'm writing. I'm seriously considering going to a pen name now because, as we'll get to in a little bit, I think, I started down a particular writing path. I'm changing, so now that I'm doing the juke, I kind of like the pen name. Lisa, why did you pick the pen? Or should I call you Elizabeth Child? Should I just keep the fiction going?
Go for it.
Lizzie, why did you do it?
Lizzie, oh, that's good. As far as a pen name, I like the idea of having a little bit of psychological separation between myself and my writer persona, so that when Elizabeth Childs gets a rejection, as she does quite often, I can say that is not my problem. That is Elizabeth Childs' problem. And I can turn off my computer and I can have dinner with my children, and they don't even call me Lisa, they call me Mommy, so it doesn't really matter. But I like that idea and it works sometimes. So that was my initial thought. Also, Lisa Reither is a little hard to pronounce and people get it wrong a lot. Reither
no offense, it's a little too German.
I like my last name for the record. But anyway, it doesn't flow super well. I don't have a great signature all worked out. And Elizabeth is my middle name, and Childs is the family surname. So it still feels like mine.
Okay. So Mandy, you do writing. Do you do, when you are, putting your writing out there, is it under Mandy or is it under, like pen name I came up with for a now abandoned romance novel, Adelaide Flynn?
Actually, I write under the name Evangeline Denmark. No, I'm kidding.
J.K. Rowling? You may have heard of it.
No, actually, this is kind of funny because I wanted to be Mandy Brown because Hauk is not the easiest. It's probably the hardest to pronounce 4-letter name ever. Houk.
The syllables are kind of in an ambiguous spot.
It's yeah.
Hauk. I feel like if you were in Canada, you'd be Hoke.
Probably. I don't know. But anyway, so my maiden name is Brown. And so I thought, that'd be cute if I wrote as Mandy Brown, because that was the little girl that wanted to write and started writing stories when she was 4. But Amanda Brown, you might have heard of her. She wrote Legally Blonde. So I felt like that was a little too close. And then I was thinking my middle name is Tyler, but Mandy Tyler, I don't know. Clearly, I've been published. I've been published in nonfiction, and I'm just Mandy Brown Hauk, because something in my brain told me that if they say Brown, they might be more likely to say Hauk, like train their brain.
Oh, that's a good like memory device.
Do you think that might be effective? I don't know.
I like it.
So, but now that like I get kind of vocal on Facebook, I'm like, I wonder if my agent might like me to have a pen name, because I don't think any. I don't know. I don't want to get all political now, but.
Oh, you've been going after it on Facebook recently.
I'm proud of you.
Thank you.
I agree with you, by the way.
Okay.
I don't like things because people on Facebook scare me, but I don't hit the like button, but I like it.
Okay, good.
You know
That's
what I
fine.
mean? I'm sending the like out towards you.
Yeah, I have an immunocompromised daughter, so I'm a mask evangelist. So, anyway.
Great,
so
now we're going to get the comments for this. Okay,
I know,
thanks,
sorry.
Mandy. Okay.
I know, yeah, so now I really do need a pen name. Mandy will not be co-hosting again. It'll be someone else with a very similar voice and a different name. So.
Hey, Adelaide Flynn's available if you want it.
Oh, that might be good. I like that.
Thank you. So, I don't know. Me and Danielle will just be sitting on the couch late at night, and I'll just be like staring out the window, and I'll be like, thinking about using a pen name. And then she'll like sigh and say this again, and then I'll give my monologue. But anyway, that is not why we're here. We are here to talk about the writing that you do under the pen name, because you have a couple little corners, little niches carved out. And I want to talk about both of the little niches. Well, first of all, let's talk about the genre that you're doing. You have a novel. It sounds like it's in the hopper, getting ready to query. By the way, my middle grade novel I talk about, I currently have a query, and I'm writing the synopsis. It's so hard. I hate myself every time I try to draft it. So that's in your future.
Yeah, I've heard that's terrible. So yeah. I'm looking forward to it.
My agent was like, can you send me like an update of your synopsis? And I wrote it. And then she goes, I'm going to tweak it a little. And then she sent it back and it was completely different. And I'm like, oh, you mean rewrite it? Cool. So that was kind of nice. I apparently did well enough to get the agent, and then she rewrote it for me. So that was helpful.
I had this problem, so we'll go a little into the weeds here, listeners, and then if any of you aren't interested in this right stuff, we're going to other places. But the synopsis is supposed to be, at least for my genre, it's 1-page single space. So I started off, it's like just vomit on the computer, and it's almost 2 pages single space. And I look at it, it's like, every word here is essential. I don't know what to do. I don't know. And I was like, I'm probably the first writer who's ever thought that every beat of their story is a precious little snowflake that can't ever be eliminated. But anyway, so your future is going to be really depressing, so just get that in your head. Okay. But before that, you started with short fiction. So what drove you to short stories to start off with?
Short stories have always been my first love, honestly. I struggle with the novel form. And I'm invested in this novel that I'm doing because I've been working on it for 6 years, on and off. But short stories are just so much easier, to be honest. And they're more fun. You can see it from start to finish so much quicker. You can send it out. You can get your rejections. You can get your acceptances sometimes, and you can go through the process so much more. And so the novel, I feel like, I've had practice doing one novel, so I'm only one novel in, but short stories, I've written dozens of them. So I know the beats. I can get it down in a month if I didn't have babies crying at me. And then I can move on to something else, because that's about the attention span that I have for my stuff.
So I will say, I haven't really tried to write short stories in a while. I've heard that's a good idea from a lot of people, so you're making a commercially sound decision from my reading of the internet, just so you know. But I also have been on this big thing where I hadn't been reading short stories in a while. Like, I'd always buy it, and then it sort of just sits on the shelf. But I just started, like, literally this past week. I started, like, in that in-between time when, like, the kids are in bed, but you have, like, 20 minutes of energy before you collapse in bed. Perfect for a short story. So I've been starting that, and it's been great. Yeah. It's been absolutely great. You get to think about something, dive in, dive out. It's great. Mandy, have you ever written in the short story genre, or are you just a connoisseur, or if not, you can just BS your way through it?
Actually, when I started writing again, it was for a short story contest in 2004. I had little kids at the time, and it was for World Magazine, actually, and I was a top 10 finalist. And the prize when you're a top 10 finalist was you get even if you don't have an agent, you can solicit a novel manuscript to a currently defunct, like most small publishers are, a now defunct publisher. But I had never written a novel, so I'm like, oh, geez, I better, I guess, write one. And that one is really bad. And then I was like, for me, it was actually, even though novels obviously take so much longer, I don't know if it's just because I'm long-winded in general, but I have a harder time writing short stories and making them meaningful. So Brett Lott, the one who wrote Jewel, and he was one of the judges. And I actually got up the guts to write to him and ask him, like, because I was top 10, but I did not end up in the top 3. And so he actually said,
I assume you finished 4th.
Right.
Well, okay, we can go there because they didn't rank them. So sure, I'll take it. Anyway, yeah, so he actually said, he goes, I really liked your writing, but he called it a bathtub story, which he said was basically nothing really happened. And he was so right. And that's actually the problem with the whole novel that came out of that. Nothing really happened. So I think for me, it's really hard to pack significant events into the short form. They really are. A novel is not a long short story. They are completely different gifts. So I don't think I'm the right person for short stories, but it is funny that it got me into the novel writing.
All right. So that was good. We all gave legit answers.
Woo!
I think the standard English, I read a bunch of short stories in college when those were the things that were assigned. But anyway, so that's the form. But really, your niches have to do with 2 things that I think may work together. So I have the idea of the niches on the internet you've carved out. How would you describe your brand as a writer?
Well, my website lists me as fiction for Exvangelical, so that is one of them. And that has a lot more to do with the themes that I deal with in my writing than it does, I think, the other thing that you're probably thinking of, which is kind of the overall
creepiness.
Feel. Yes, creepy. And okay, I'm creepy. It's creepiness. I'll just own it. Yeah, it is creepy, but it's also like, it's not straight up horror. It's like literary, strange, magical realism, I guess. And I really like that. Some of my favorite short stories are kind of on the horror end of things. And I think we'll probably get into that a little later. Or, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
but
you didn't read
there's
the show notes I sent you.
I read them a while ago. And then I forgot. So yeah, I've got the fiction for Exvangelicals, which is really what my heart is for my readers. And then the aesthetic, which is magical realism, literary, creepy.
Okay. So let's unpack that. That's something I always say at work when I'm talking to my clients. Let's go through that point by point. So first of all, the term exvangelical, I feel like me and you are very well acquainted with it because we have spent a lot of time thinking about this sort of thing. Mandy, have you spent as much time thinking about the term exvangelical, or is this like a millennial Zoomer thing?
I think it's a millennial Zoomer thing. I read the definition on her website, on Elizabeth Child's website. I was like, what? Exvangelical. So I looked it up.
There's a reason
So now
there's a
I
whole
know.
page for it on my website.
So I think I am one, but I didn't know.
So this is one of those things, it's kind of like evangelical, which no one quite knows what we're all talking about. There's like 20 million definitions of it, so you read one, it's like, I guess that's me. You're like, oh, that's not me at all. It's like, maybe, I don't know. So how would you define exvangelical, and do you need an evangelical definition to define exvangelical?
Well, I think you probably do. Obviously, exvangelical is just someone who used to be an evangelical and doesn't identify as such anymore. And that is me and a lot of other people that probably don't even know that this is a community of people that they belong to. But yeah, it can mean a ton of different things to different people. A lot of the people that hold on to this exvangelical label are people who have been pushed out of the church for various reasons. They've been shamed out, they've been ignored, they have committed what the church would consider unforgivable sins. And of course, the church would not say that. But the way they are treated makes it clear to them, or at least makes them feel like they are not welcome anymore. And I have seen that happen too often to hold that label for myself anymore. I've seen it happen to LGBT community. I've seen it happen to friends of mine who have been in abusive relationships and told to stay in them. I've seen it happen to single mothers. You know, the whole, I don't want to get too into it. I mean, I could talk about this for a whole hour, but those are my people, and that's who I write for. That's who I have a heart for. And those are the people that I want to bring hope to, bring life to, whether they have returned to the church or not. That's not really part of an exvangelical definition, because I myself am still a Christian. I still identify as a Christian.
We literally go to the same church.
Yes, we do. I go to an Anglican church in Colorado Springs. I'm part of the Anselm Society. But that doesn't have anything to do with exvangelical. And a lot of the definition has to do with the way that people define evangelicalism in America right now. And I can't help but get a little political here.
Right.
What are you guys doing to my comments?
I know.
I'm
sorry.
whatever.
And I won't.
Okay.
And I don't. I don't want to get too far into it because I know you have a wide listenership.
A very wide listenership, and we
Yes.
love each little snowflake listening to us very much. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yes. And I realize that people react and do the things that they do as a way to survive in their faith. But the thing that really kind of pushed me over into exvangelicalism was, one, seeing a good friend of mine shamed for staying in, for not getting out of an abusive relationship by the church and told to stay in it. Also, LGBT community. I'm just politically left. That's just who I am. I'm not going to apologize for it, and you won't convince me otherwise. But that's one of the things that I saw within the church that I just could not handle, was the treatment of that community. and then the 2016 election cycle, which I think a lot of exvangelicals would point to as kind of a turning point for them. And for me, it wasn't really the fact that evangelicals supported our current president, but the fact that that voter base was so easily manipulated into supporting him. And that's what really curdled my stomach and still does. And to see them now also being easily manipulated by conspiracy theories and things that are happening right now, it just makes me even more convinced that this is where I belong.
Okay, well, she throws her last bomb, then hands me back the microphone. Okay, so, go for it, Mandy.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, it sounds to me like the exvangelical pull is really a yearning for more transparency, because to me, I think what can be so frustrating in the American evangelical churches is this idea that you have to look a certain way, behave a certain way. You know, even my young daughters, they're in their 20s and they're seeing, wow, I don't matter yet because I'm not married, you know, and so that's even just a single woman who plans and hopes to get married. If they're ignored, then what happens when, as you said, someone leaves a marriage for very personal reasons that may be biblical? So it's sort of like if you're not in lockstep and you don't look the way you're supposed to look and say the words you're supposed to say, then you're excluded. And so to me, I found, because as we all know, because we bring it up, I do bring it up all the time. I'm older than y'all. But so I can remember a lot of marriages falling apart when I was in my 30s within the church, and it was because, in large part, those married couples didn't know how to admit that they were struggling. And so it's like a falseness that we just need to get rid of, because transparency is where the truth lies.
Yeah, and something I'll say too, because for those of you who listened to the early days of the pod, when I started this, I was writing a memoir based on, growing up very evangelical and wrestling with all this stuff, and then I got to the point I told all you Anselm writers all about this, like, I just can't do this anymore. I just didn't want to write it on it anymore. So I write middle grade fiction about dinosaurs now. So a couple difficulties here. And first of all, there may be some folks who kind of got their hackles up with some of this stuff. So let me say, first of all, the term evangelical is so broad and applies to so many stuff. I think a response could be, Lisa, and I agree with you on pretty much everything, is that maybe instead of saying leaving the evangelical church, leaving really rotted, twisted subsets of the evangelical church. It's obvious. Some varieties of evangelicalism are really weird and unhealthy, and others, I've been in evangelical churches that are really healthy and great. And we all know people who are in those communities who are really great and wonderful people, wonderful Christians who don't apply to any of this stuff we've just been talking about. So that's one part. And the other part is I struggle with, how important is this label now, especially since something that I've been assuring myself with, on these times I stare out into oblivion out my front window late at night. It's we all see the things that frustrate us with, the church right now. We can all list them. But when it comes down to it, thank you, Lord, the white American evangelical church is a very small subset of the church worldwide. It's there's some things that we do that are really weird that other branches don't do. And I'm sure there's things other branches do that are really off that maybe we see better. It's sort of like that old C.S. Lewis essay on the reading of old books. It's some things the old writers got right that we're wrong on. There's some things that they're wrong on that we see. But so there's some things that we get very, very wrong. And I think it's from a melding of Americanism with Christianity and some individualism, all that stuff. And that makes it very tricky. And I'm just sort of babbling now. But Lisa, I saw you write a note before you started talking, so you have something in mind.
I do. I totally agree with you. This is a subset of a subset of a subset that we are reacting against. However, I think the label is important because we're trying to find our people. We're trying to find community. And when you say evangelicalism to someone who has left the church, they know what you mean. They're not thinking about the nice churches. You know? They're thinking about the church that kicked them out. And again, like you said, there are plenty of theologically evangelical churches who are welcoming and loving and beautiful parts of the world. But here in America, when you hear the word evangelical, that's not what springs to mind automatically. And I think I just have to accept that, because that's what the word has come to mean right now in America, is, like you said, kind of this melding of nationalism and theology in this really, really scary kind of twisted way. And I honestly, just for me personally and for the people who have been kicked out of the church, I just want that as far away from me as possible. And if that means taking the opposite word to react against that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, a couple points there. One of the last ideas I threw out there before I decided to abandon all that stuff for dinosaurs was saying that I'm cool with the label evangelical as an adjective, but I don't like it as a noun.
Oh, I like that.
So basically, I think a lot of times evangelicalism goes wrong because it's not rooted in anything. You know, it started off with a lot of good intentions, like, hey, let's just really win souls, preach the gospel, let's not weigh them down with all this extra stuff. Okay, there's a lot of good stuff there. But then it becomes, very thin, not rooted in history, not rooted in, learning from the past. And then once it becomes its own thing, it's very easy to twist, to manipulate. It's like, oh, we'll blow with these political breezes in this cultural wind. And that makes it very easy to do. So that's why it shouldn't be a noun. But if it's attached to something, like I am an Anglican, I like Anglo-Catholic, and I was told by my mom's cousin, who is a professor at an Anglican seminary, that evangelical Anglo-Catholicism is a thing. So take that, because I can see you looking at me skeptically.
I don't know.
So being like the noun Anglican is more important to me than the label. But if you attach like I'm an evangelical Anglican, that to me means more like, oh, I'm an Anglican and I, really believe what I mean, and I think other people should too, and all that other sort of more non-objectable stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe the problem, you hit it when you said political. I think as I was sitting here thinking about it, especially I agree when it becomes a noun. And I think most often when it's used as a noun, it's in political demographic terms. Yeah. So white evangelicals. And so if we do want to make ourselves distinct, like don't hang that label on me and therefore assume that I am pro this, anti this, pro this person, anti that person, because I am this evangelical label. And so maybe really what we're talking about here is reclaiming the purer definition of the word. It's not the word, it's the label and what it's come to mean in America.
Yeah, that's true. I agree. Evangelical theology is a totally different thing than what you would hear if I said you're an evangelical. Right. But who really cares if you have a label for your theology? Who does that help? Like I said, Exvangelical is about finding community, and evangelicals are doing the same thing. I don't really care what you call my theology. I believe the Bible, but I don't know how that helps me.
I hope you believe the 39 articles if you're an Anglican.
Oh, of course.
Okay, good.
But even that, I go to an Anglican church, but I go there because for a number of reasons, not just because it's an Anglican church. So the label is really only important to me in a societal context, not a theological one.
Yeah, and I think that then depends on the group you're talking to. With the group like you all, who I know have a lot of the backstories, I'll be an evangelical Anglican, that's fine. But if I'm talking to somebody who I don't know, or who doesn't have a deep knowledge of, this particular niche, just some person on the streets, if they ask me, are you an evangelical? I'm probably what do you mean by that? Which is what I've done before, and it's always awkward. So I don't know, maybe to put a bow, this is a very complicated subject we're tiptoeing in. And once again, I totally get huge span of listeners who have a full span of visceral feelings, either pro or against for evangelical, but I think we can agree that the forms we're taking are really, what we're talking about here is a specific subset of it, and the way you're doing, at least, I think is a really good and healthy thing, and especially the way that you're incorporating it into your fiction, even though it super creeps me out. So let's talk about it now that
Good segue.
Lisa throws the political bombs, and we can talk about her creepy literature. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for coming on the show, Lisa. If there's any more hot button topics you'd like to address, feel free to.
I mean, maybe this one won't record either. You'll get lucky.
But let's talk about some of the themes you put in there. So you said earlier that you think the sort of exvangelical thing, it's important because of the themes that get woven into your stories. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, a lot of my works deal with themes of justice. I would say the majority of my short stories deal with a tragedy or some kind of injustice that I just can't wrap my mind around, and I yearn to bring some kind of resolution to that, even though, of course, I can't in real life. I am doing it through my fiction. So, like in particular, The Beckoning Green talks a lot about the generational effect of American war and secondary trauma that's dealt with by both the survivors and their family members even. And that's something that I wish, that pain is something I wish I could take away from people, and so I'm doing it through my fiction instead. And that's part of the reason that the creepiness and the magical realism exists in my stories, is because sometimes that's the only way that I can bring justice to those situations, is by taking it out of this physical world and bringing these magical elements that don't exist here, because you can't
Right.
you can't bring justice to everything without that kind of supernatural intervention. Another one of my stories, called Little Miss Stradivarius, is at its heart about the generational effect of domestic violence, and how incredibly difficult it is for women and children to escape those situations, and how very powerless they can feel and can be in even reality in some of those situations. Let's see, what else am I forgetting?
I wanted to ask about, like, with Little Miss Stradivarius, I thought it seemed very intentional that the abused personhood was an inanimate object, really, the violin. And so that really felt, I am fortunate enough never have been in a long-term abusive relationship or anything, but I have seen it, and I imagine that must be just the powerlessness. I mean, you can't get more powerless than being an inanimate object. So that was really powerful to me.
Yeah, that certainly is intentional, and thank God that there are certainly resources available to domestic abuse survivors, and that many of those women are able to escape. But in some situations, for some people, they really do feel and are powerless, and they really cannot escape. And you're exactly right. That's what that was going for. That's what I was going for.
I feel so smart.
You are so smart.
You get an A on the thought paper.
Yay!
Yeah, another one of my short stories called The Acts of Kings, that was just released in June in Read magazine. It's about a couple of things, actually. It's about the Syrian civil war that's currently going on, and it's also about the children who were murdered by King Herod after the wise men visited him on their way to see Jesus. And so it's a frame story, it's a story within a story, and it deals with both of those atrocities and the things that I just cannot understand, like, how can this happen? How can this be part of a greater story? So that's what that one's about.
So some nice light topics that we're delving into right now, but yeah, I do find it interesting, like those seasons that you mentioned, and that totally makes sense. You can see where it relates to, but let's talk about the atmosphere in general, because I want to paint a word picture for all the listeners out there. Picture the Anselm Society Arts Guild meeting. We meet in this, this is pre-COVID when we can meet with people. Remember that?
Vaguely?
Yeah.
I try not to think about it. It makes me sad.
I'll comment to Danielle every now and then. It's like, first of all, it's like, hey, what day is it? And then it's like, trying to think of the people I've talked to this week that aren't you or one of the kids.
Right.
It's like, oh no, that was a Zoom call. But
people are still three-dimensional, apparently.
Weird.
Yeah.
But anyway, we meet together with the Anselm artists. We'd all like share stuff. Someone would share a painting or someone would share a poem. I'd share my stories that are, about dinosaurs and fairies and other things geared at 11-year-olds. And then Lisa comes and starts reading the story. And as she's reading, I slowly like curl into a ball because the creepiness is just too much for me to take. So, Lisa, why are your stories creepy?
I think a better question is, why are they creepy to you? Because you seem to have a more visceral reaction than a lot of people, or maybe you're just more overt about it. I don't know. But
more honest?
Maybe.
I've known you for longer, so I can be like, oh, that's creepy, Lisa.
I guess that's true. A lot of them do involve birds, and Matt does have a thing about birds, so that's probably my fault.
They're paper birds, Matt. It's okay.
It's called ornithophobia, and dozens of Americans suffer from it.
Well, you'll really like my new one then that I just started sending out, because there's lots of birds in there. No, to be honest, like the creepiness is really just what piques my imagination. When I get an idea, I think, ooh, that's really interesting. The story that I just finished, that I just started sending out, was inspired by a line in my novel, actually, in which the main character wonders what would happen if she had just lost a tooth, and she wonders what would happen if she buried it in the ground and it grew a tree. And so that's what the short story, that was the initial spark for the short story. And I don't want to give away too much, but it's about a child who has to make a painful sacrifice to restore balance to nature in this kind of pioneer Western town. Ends up having to do is pull his teeth out and bury them in the ground in order to restore kind of their relationship. So that was the initial spark, and that's what gets me going, is that little bit of weirdness, that little bit of, ooh, I've never heard that before. It kind of like gives me a little shiver, and I'm like, yeah, I can make something really cool out of that.
Right. See, for me, when I read your stuff, I'm so jealous that you are willing to go there, because I see it as like courageous from my point of view, because I am constantly questioning, will the reader get that? That's so, and I mean, I've certainly never, written about a violin getting pregnant. So I don't, I actually reread, I'm like, is that a spoiler? No, it's like the first paragraph. So it's okay. That's Little Miss Stradivarius. But I just want to know, are you ever tempted to pull back? Like, do you ever picture the reader going, what? Because so for me, my novel right now, I'm rewriting it because my agent wants me to, and that's what you do. But I realized the best way to write this is to go crazy with my POV. I've got third person limited, then I've got first person this guy, but that's the way I feel like it has to be written. And no joke, I'm not flattering you. You've not paid me any money. But honestly, I'm like, look, if Lisa can have a violin get pregnant, then you can switch POVs however much you want, because it's brilliant though. I'm like, why does that story work? But it does. So anyway, back to my question. Do you back off? Are you tempted to back off?
Yeah, do you ever picture Matt squirming on the chair as you're reading this? Like, maybe I should pull back a little.
No, that's my inspiration. That's what I'm going for. No, as far as the creepiness, I've never been tempted to back off. As far as some of the themes that I tackle, sometimes I do. I do feel the need to back off. And sometimes it's just purely story related. Like in The Beckoning Green, when I originally wrote it, and it's a story about a girl who has this unique physical ability to basically turn invisible when plants touch her. But it's about American wars. And there was this whole thread through the story when I originally wrote it about traditional Christian hymns that are a lot about battle and nationalism and patriotism kind of woven in there. And I ended up taking it out, not because I don't believe it or didn't think my readers would get it, but just because it muddled the story. Okay. And it made the story less laser focused, and that's not what I wanted. In other cases, I have a story called Gina the Dinosaur.
Hey, that's...
Yeah, I don't think you'd like this one. And it has a rape scene in it. And that one has not been picked up yet. And I go back to that story often to see if I need to take it out or change it somehow to make it less visceral to get it published. And every time I've read it back, I end up sitting back and said, I like it. Like, I mean, I don't like it, but
no, I know. Yeah.
I believe in it the way it is.
Right.
And if it never gets published, I'll put it in a short story collection, and then people will have to read it. But yeah, there's that one. As far as Little Miss Stradivarius goes, I was not tempted to back off as far as the strangeness of the violin, but that story has been the most polarizing story I have ever written. And I did not expect it when I wrote it. I sent it out to some beta readers, and I got some people who loved it, and I have people that hate it, absolutely hate it.
Wow.
And I didn't expect that, and it kind of strangely falls along gender lines. And I think one of the first women to tell me that they like that story.
Oh,
actually.
Okay.
Or maybe you don't actually like it. I don't know.
No, I did. I was super uncomfortable with it, and I had to sit with it, and I wasn't sure I liked it until I really mulled it over. But no, I do, because I appreciate what you did.
Yeah, that story in general, and I still don't know quite why it is that story is so polarizing, but even for me, I am not the biggest fan of that story, and maybe I shouldn't say that, I don't know, but that story is not my favorite, because I feel when I read it back, a lot more anger in the way that I wrote it than I do in some of the other stories. It's it's more vindictive than I meant it to be, even though I think some of those things need to be said and are true. Especially when it comes to the evangelical response to domestic violence, which it does deal with, or at least tangentially deals with. But when I read it back, I look at that and say, I meant to put more hope in there, and there's not as much as I felt like I put in there. And so I've had to be intentional since writing that story to look at my stories through that lens also, not just saying what I think needs to be said, but also where do we go from there?
Right.
And I think I missed that in that story. Did I answer that question? I forgot what your question was.
Yeah.
So we're running a little low on time. I want to wrap up with talking about magical realism, because I love magical realism. I just love it to pieces. It was one of the enduring terms that I learned in my English classes, like, oh, I can use that. So what about that really drew you in, and why do you think they're so effective in your stories? And give a definition for our listeners. You've thrown so many bombs at them. It help them out a little.
Okay. Magical realism is a genre of writing where paranormal things happen. I don't know whether that's quite the right word, but they are incorporated into the actual world. So it's not fantasy in that there's a totally different world, or even that you start in this world and go to a different world. That's still fantasy. Magical realism would be like my story, The Beckoning Green, where this totally normal girl goes outside one day, picks up a flower or whatever she does, and her hand starts disappearing. And that is woven into the rest of the story, even though she's living like a pretty normal life. You know, she gets married, she has kids, she dies, and this is still part of her life all along. And people accept it as real. It's a real part of this real world. It's just magical or supernatural or whatever. And so a lot of my stories deal with that kind of thing. And I think it's just another one of those things that makes me excited to write something, because I feel like I've got an idea that hasn't been done to death. It's not, I'm not a huge fan, and I've seen it done well, but not a big fan of slice of life kind of literary writing. And so this is not like, it's just not something that I can write either. I don't think it's a coincidence that the two stories that I've written that haven't been picked up yet don't have that magical realism in them. They don't have that strangeness. They don't have that twist. They are kind of just straight up literary fiction, as you would think of it. And I think they are still shocking in areas. I think there's still things to be said in those stories, but I don't think that's what I'm best at. And it makes me feel like that is my uniqueness that I can actually bring to writing that I can't bring to other kinds of writing. So that's what I tend to go to, because that's what I want to write.
Yeah, one of the things I like about the magical realism form is it's a lot more jarring to have it presented that way, because, you know, if you're telling something in like a traditional fairy tale format, it's like, okay, you know, the magical elements are coming, you know, it's part of the style, it's baked in. But when you see something that's presented as like you said, a slice of life sort of thing, but then, oh, something really weird happens. It really jars you, it grabs you. It's like, oh, okay. And then it sort of makes you sort of redirect the way that you view everything with it. I just love it. It's a really great thing.
Well, and I think my favorite one that I've read of yours is the one that was nominated for the Pushcart Prize, Archimedes, which I think you read in this house, in my house. So I feel like I need royalties. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, can I give my contribution too? Lisa sent that to me to send some edits with it. So I made my edits. I duly added all my little notes to add, and I sent them away. And Lisa told me that the version I sent did not have the track changes on it, so she could not use them.
Oh, man. Well, but
so that's my contribution.
one of the things
Even better.
It could have been even better.
One of the things I really liked about that, though, and that's the kind of story where even when you finish reading, you're not sure if what was happening happened in reality or just in the head of the character. And you just absolutely nailed that. And I love that story. I've read it like 3 times. I printed it out.
Oh, thanks.
All right. Well, wow. We are right at about 50 minutes here. That's the target length. So.
Wow.
Wow.
Good job.
Yes. Time flies when you're having fun, causing all sorts of trouble.
I know.
But anyway, thank you so much, Mandy. Thank you so much, Lisa / Elizabeth Childs. Maybe in closing, tell us where we can find your writing.
Yeah, my website is www.elizabeth-childs.com. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and technically on Instagram, but I don't do anything on there. So my website is where all these stories are posted. The majority of them are free to read online. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you again. And, well, looks like things are quieting down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The last patrons are leaving. The bartender is cleaning out the last of the mugs. And I'm still trying to convince everyone that evangelical Anglo-Catholicism is a real thing. Once again, if you want to find out more about the Anselm Society, visit us at anselmsociety.org. Don't forget to rate and review the show. Really do appreciate it. And once again, I'm Matthew Mellema. See you next time.